Before starting this PowerPoint, I wanted to let everybody know that the quality of the sound going forward is probably going to change fairly drastically. If you do have difficulty listening to the audio or understanding what's being said, feel free to read the notes that are in each of the PowerPoint slides in the notes section. Welcome to PSYC 379, Chapter 3, Critical Thinking in Cross-Cultural Psychology. This slide is looking at the evaluative bias of language, and we're looking in particular at objective evaluation and subjective evaluation. The distinction between objective description and subjective evaluation is very often unclear, and this is in large part because words both describe and evaluate. So whenever we describe something or someone, the words we use are almost invariably value-laden, and by this I mean that they reflect our own personal likes and dislikes. Therefore, our use of any particular term not only serves to describe, but also prescribe what is desirable or undesirable to us. So for this slide, I've included a table that you can find in your book that describes adjectives or descriptors from Jenny's value system and from Lee's value system. And what I really wanted to highlight here is that the language that we learn and then use can have a powerful impact on how we think about ourselves, others, and the world around us. The example that's on this slide demonstrates the same phenomenon as described from two different perspectives. Now, the book deems Lee's values as consistently more positive than Jenny's attributions. However, I'd also like you to think not only about the propositional evaluations or the judgments, the conscious judgments, but also on how accurate or helpful it is to think in any of these terms. So does irresponsible better account for someone's actions and the consequences of those actions than spontaneous? And if so, is it helpful to think about it in those terms? So what I'm really asking is, does it make it easier or harder for the individual to function within their environment if they think about actions as irresponsible versus spontaneous? So what I would suggest is just asking yourself whether this would change in different contexts. So depending on who Jenny is or who Lee is, the context as well as the larger cultural landscape, would that make a difference for them as they kind of interact with others and think about themselves, whether or not they're thinking about things from Jenny's perspective or from Lee's perspective? So is it different for different people, even within the same context? Something like one variable that you might want to consider is, does thinking about things in a certain way depend on how much power or influence the individual has in that culture? And does that make a difference as far as thinking about things from Jenny's perspective versus Lee's perspective in making things okay for themselves in that context? So what works for them within their context that keeps reinforcing this particular value system? So on this slide, there's antidotes to the evaluative bias in language. And the book highlights these points to remember that descriptions, especially concerning personality characteristics, can never be entirely objective, impartial, or neutral. To become aware of your own personal values and biases and how these influence the language that you use. Avoid presenting your value judgments as objective reflections of the truth. And recognize how other people's use of language reveals their own values and biases. Now, I also wanted to add that often these biased attitudes can seem like automatic or uncontrollable reactions. And really this makes sense considering the barrage of stereotypic and prejudicial messages that we receive on a regular basis. However, with practice, individuals can become extremely adept at reevaluating the accuracy and helpfulness of these messages. In fact, an extremely well-researched psychological approach called cognitive behavioral therapy proposes that individuals can learn to identify thinking errors and then modify them. So one of the sheets that I've uploaded onto Blackboard is entitled Thinking Errors, and this has examples of common cognitive distortions that people regularly engage in. Now, if you do decide to take a look at it, it might be familiar reminder for those of you that recently took the SATs, the GREs, or are interested in law school. Often these are presented in very similar ways as distortions or logical fallacies. Dichotomous and continuous variables. So some phenomena can be divided or bifurcated into two mutually exclusive or contradictory categories. These types of phenomena are called dichotomous variables, and some examples might be a light switch is either on or off. An individual was either born in Rwanda or he wasn't. Another type of phenomena, by contrast, consists of a theoretically infinite number of points between two polar opposites. So these types of phenomena are continuous variables. So, for example, between the extremes of black and white, there exists a middle ground comprised of innumerable shades of gray. Time and distance would also be examples of continuous variables. The book offers what they call antidotes to navigating dichotomous and continuous variables in research. So the first thing is to learn to differentiate between variables that are in fact dichotomous and those that are continuous. And remember that most person-related phenomena such as traits, attitudes, and beliefs are going to lie along a continuum. When making cross-cultural comparisons, it's important to try to avoid artificial or false dichotomies, which can oftentimes be easy to do, but collectivism and traditionalism are actually continuous variables and are not actually polar opposites that are mutually exclusive. The similarity-uniqueness paradox is presented in the book, and I felt like it was important enough that I wanted to make special note to talk about it here in the PowerPoint as well. So they pose the question, which of the following four words does not belong with the other three? Is it A, Canadian, B, Italian, C, Cuban, or D, Hindu? The correct answer to this question is D, because Hindu is the only term that represents a religion rather than a nationality. But wait, the correct answer is B, because none of the others is European. Then again, the correct answer is actually C, because this is the only group with a communist government. Not quite. The correct answer is A, because Canadian is the only word on the list that contains an even number of letters. Ha! You fell victim to one of the classic blunders, the most famous of which is never get involved in a land war in Asia. No, that's not right. A little Princess Bride humor. Okay, so the book also offers some antidotes when dealing with the similarity-uniqueness paradox. The first is when comparing and contrasting any two phenomena, you want to ask yourself, in what ways are they similar and in what ways are they different? And then before beginning your evaluation, you also want to ask yourself, what is actually the purpose of this analysis? And in asking this question, it will help you choose the most appropriate and relevant dimensions and sorting of the variables. So you want to carefully and judiciously select the dimensions on which you will evaluate various phenomena, recognizing that the dimensions you select will ultimately determine the degree of similarity or uniqueness displayed between the two phenomena. Despite what may appear to be an overwhelming number of similarities between two events, always search for and take into account their differences. And conversely, regardless of what might seem to be a total absence of commonalities between two events, search for and take into account their similarities. You really don't want to allow yourself to be swayed by individuals who maintain these events are exactly the same, or you can't compare these events because they have absolutely nothing in common. Beware of extremes. A Barnum statement is a personality description about a particular individual or group that is true of practically all human beings. In other words, it's a general statement that has a little something for everybody. The Barnum effect refers to people's willingness to accept the validity of such overly inclusive and generic appraisals, also referred to as a one-size-fits-all description. Now, this effect was named after P.T. Barnum, a world-renowned circus man who who was also known for such gems as "There's a sucker born every minute," and "Every crowd has a silver lining." I also want to add that I find it pretty ironic that in a culture that often so highly values individuality and individual merit, that Barnum statements are frequently employed in debate. I'd also like you to notice that I was very careful to qualify each part of the statement I just made, and I'm not prevaricating, I'm demonstrating antidote 3 on slide 11. Now here's a list of some examples of Barnum statements, or the Barnum effect. So if you're reading through these and you're like, that's a pretty apt description, no. Stop yourself and consider, how is this not true of the group, and is this really all-inclusive to describe everything that's substantial about this particular population or individuals that fall within this population? Especially when you get to the last one. So like all of the other distortions that the book talks about, they offer some antidotes to the Barnum effect. So the first one is to learn to differentiate Barnum statements from person and group-specific descriptions and interpretations. Be aware of the limited utility inherent in Barnum statements. Specifically, remember that although Barnum statements have validity about people in general, they fail to reveal anything distinctive about any given individual or sociocultural group. Whenever feasible and appropriate, make it a point to reduce the Barnum effect by qualifying personality descriptions and interpretations in terms of their magnitude or degree. The next topic is the assimilation bias. And one of the most fundamental and pervasive of all human psychological activities is the propensity to categorize. People appear to possess an innate drive to classify, organize, systemize, group, subgroup, and otherwise structure the world around them. And the picture that I put on the slide is putting a square peg in a round hole. Sometimes the categorization is helpful, and sometimes it misrepresents what we're trying to actually understand. So we conceptualize all categories as mental representations or schemas, and a schema is a cognitive structure that organizes our knowledge, beliefs, and past experiences, thereby providing a framework for understanding new events and future experiences. So what happens when you come across new information that's discrepant from our preconceptions? Another way of thinking about it is, what do you do when there's a clash between the data or new information and our existing schemas? Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget identified two complementary processes that we utilize in such situations: accommodation and assimilation. And according to Piaget, both of these responses are integral components of the cognitive development and constitute the means by which we adapt to our environment and construct our reality. Accommodation refers to the process wherein we modify our schemas to fit the new data. So in other words, we're actually changing our pre-existing belief system to make room for or accommodate the new information. In contrast, assimilation means to modify the data to fit our schema. So here we're incorporating new information into our pre-existing beliefs, even if it means that we're distorting the information itself. Now, this bias manifests itself in a wide variety of forms and contexts. Specifically, it leads us to rely excessively on vivid but not necessarily appropriate information to fill gaps in our knowledge with schema-consistent but erroneous information. So schemas oftentimes distort our perceptions of reality in order to make them consistent with what we already believe. As such, the assimilation bias represents a significant obstacle to clear thinking and effective problem solving. In viewing the world through schema-colored glasses, we subject virtually all of the incoming information to varying degrees of distortion, misinterpretation, and invalidation. So you might be thinking to yourself, oh no, I'm guilty of using the assimilation bias. Don't worry, there's antidotes. The first first is do not underestimate the extent to which your prior beliefs, knowledge, and expectations or schemata can affect your current experiences, impressions, and perceptions. So it's important, therefore, to try to become as aware as possible of schemata that are important to you. And this is because awareness of schemata increases your ability to then modify them. The third antidote is experiment with temporarily lowering or altering your perceptual filters or schema-colored glasses. And you do this by attempting to understand someone else's subjective or phenomenological perceptions and experience. Then you can learn to differentiate your use of assimilation versus accommodation, and particularly when you're faced with discrepancy between your beliefs or your schemas and the information, the data. And in general, just be aware of the general tendency to assimilate rather than to accommodate. And lastly, you want to prod yourself to accommodate when out of habit or reflex or just sheer laziness, you would typically be inclined to automatically assimilate. So now we're going to talk about the availability bias. And what I'd like to do before I continue is to have you give your best estimate for the following questions. What are the odds of sustaining a fatal accident traveling by car as compared with traveling by commercial airplane? Which racial group comprises the largest proportion of U.S. citizens living in poverty? Blacks, whites, or Hispanics? Which age group is at highest risk for committing suicide? Teens, people in their middle age, or elderly? Now here's some estimates. People are nearly 100 times more likely to die in an automobile accident than in a commercial airplane. Nearly half of all poor individuals in the U.S. are white, approximately 1/4 are black, and just under 1/4 are Hispanic. The elderly, 65 and older, display the highest proportion of self-inflicted deaths in the U.S. Now some, or maybe all of these estimates might have surprised you. And some of this information might not have fallen in with the common narrative that you've heard about either the issues or the populations. And unsurprisingly, these questions demonstrate availability bias. Perhaps the single most important factor underlying availability bias is our propensity to underuse, discount, or even ignore relevant base rate information, which is data about the actual frequency of events in a particular group, and other abstract statistical facts in favor of more salient and concrete, but usually less reliable anecdotal evidence. As a consequence, personal testimonials, graphic case studies, dramatic stories, colorful tales, intriguing narratives, eye-catching illustrations, vibrant images, all of these things are liable to slant, skew, or otherwise distort our judgments. Now, if you're particularly interested in how statistics are not just misused and misrepresent, or not just misused and also can misrepresent information to shape public perception, but are also interested in the ways how and why that we as a people are so apt to readily believe numerical arguments, then I would highly recommend a book called Damn Lies in Statistics, Untangling Numbers from the Media, Politician, and Activists by Joel Best. The following 4 suggestions are antidotes to dealing with the availability bias that the book presents. The first is when estimating the frequency or probability of an event, remind yourself not to reach a conclusion based solely on the ease or speed in which relevant instances can be retrieved from your memory. Secondly, take anecdotal evidence not with a grain but with several large shakers of salt. Although personal testimonies and vivid cases might be persuasive, they're not inherently trustworthy indicators of fact. The third point is to make a conscious effort, whenever feasible, to seek out and utilize base rate information and other pertinent statistical data. And the fourth is to remember that the best basis for drawing valid generalizations is from a representative sample of relevant cases. last topic that I have for chapter 3 is that correlation does not equal causation. And there's a little cute comic strip that I found that I just pasted on that I thought illustrated this point pretty nicely, where one character says, "I used to think correlation implied causation. Then I took a statistics class, and now I don't." And the other character says, "Sounds like the class helped." And the first character says, "Well, maybe." So a correlation is a statement about the relationship or association between two or more variables, and correlations thus enable us to make predictions from one variable or event to another. That is, if two events are correlated or co-appear, then the presence of one provides us with information about the other event. A correlation, however, does not necessarily establish a causal relationship between the variables. In other words, causation cannot be proven simply by virtue of a correlation or co-appearance. And I refer you to the murder and ice cream example from the previous PowerPoint. In fact, the book actually shares a very similar example. So it's been established that there's more aggression in hot meteorological conditions than in cold ones. For example, rates of homicide and rape are generally higher and warmer than colder climates. So why might this be? It would be absurd, of course, to propose that the weather is affected by violent crimes. And it certainly is much more likely that the meteorological conditions somehow affect violent behavior. However, we don't know if there's other factors such as poverty, density of population, or government policies that might affect incidents of homicide and rape. So I want you to just beware of concluding causation based solely on correlation or co-appearance. And further, when a correlation is observed, make sure to examine all plausible pathways and directions of causation. Once again, the book offers several antidotes to kind of falling under the correlation causing causation misinterpretation. So the first is, remember that correlation or co-appearance is not in and of itself proof of causation. Keep in mind that correlations enable us to make predictions from one event to the other, but they do not, however, provide explanations as to why the events are related. When a correlation is observed, you should consider all possible pathways and directions of causation. So I've kind of pictorially represented a couple of the different ways that you can think about things. So for example, if event A and B are correlated, does A cause B, B cause A, maybe A and B cause each other, or potentially a third factor, C, might cause both A and B. I figured that the end of chapter 3 would be a good place to add a little bit of helpful information for when you're doing research for either this class or another class, especially as you start to take on worksheets or projects. So the resource that I'm going to just really briefly give you some information about is called Google Scholar. And I think that this is a really helpful tool to actually use in tandem with your GMU account to get access, free resources essentially. But it's got a couple of added benefits. So there's two things that I want to show you. One is how to actually get articles, and one is how to help you cite articles. So the first thing is you go to Google Scholar, and you can type in whatever key phrase you want, author. I mean, it's kind of the same thing that you would be using when you would be searching through the GMU library database. Once you identify the article that you want, you would click on the title of the article, and it'll take you to a page where you can purchase the article. But instead of purchasing, you would go to the HTML line, and you would plug in .mutex.gmu.edu, just as it's written on this slide, where I've shown you. So right between the black font where it turns gray is where you would enter it. You press enter after you type that in, and then it will take you to your GMU login page. You enter your password and ID, and then it will take you back to the original page where instead of purchasing it, it'll offer you the article for free. So that's one thing that's super helpful. The other thing, if you actually go back to the page before you clicked on the article itself, you'll see that there's a couple of links right below where you can see other articles that have cited this, other articles that are related to this article. But what I find particularly helpful is if you click Cite, It'll give you MLA, APA, a couple of other ways of citing, and you can copy and paste the APA style citation.